because some people have had some Zoom issues and time issues making sure we get in, but we wanted to have enough people inside our little Zoom area here before we got started. So I'd like to welcome everybody today to the LTADchat based around youth sport post-COVID solution session. So kind of a little bit of a kickoff here to the conversation, letting everybody know that some of the issues that are going on in the youth sports community, there have been a lot of Zoom conversations going on, focused primarily on just providing general information about what's going on out there without actual solutions for those boots on the ground practitioners who are working with our kids every day. So we wanted to put together this session. We have a great list of people here. So on behalf of Joe Eisenman, Tony Marino, Nate Baldwin, and Steve Boyle, I would like to welcome everybody for participating today and being on this call. And we say participate because different from a lot of the other Zoom calls that you probably have been on, we really want your input. So we want to break into groups after we go through a little early discussion here. Joe's going to put some links over on the side here because there are a lot of wonderful organizations that have already laid the groundwork for what needs to be done. But we really need to hear from you today about how to do it and then make those solutions for what we're going to do next and where we're going to go. So with everything that's going on in our country right now, I think one of the things that we need to pay special attention to is the importance of sport. Some people might be saying at this point in time that, you know, we have so many other issues in our world, in our country to think about. Sport might not be one of the things we need to think about, but sport does have the power to change. So we go back to the Nelson Mandela quote. It speaks to youth in a language they understand, and it creates hope where there once was despair. So I think it's important for us to remember, first of all, as we move forward, that sports is an important part of our culture. It's something that we're all on this call because we believe strongly about it. Some of the organizations that have come up with some recommendations and guidelines are being shared over in the Zoom group chat now, so you can certainly take a look at those. Feel free to reach out to some of those organizations and see what they have. But our guess is that several of you who are joining our call today probably know a lot of these organizations already. We're here so that we can get some work done and to provide some solutions. So I'm excited to, at this point in time, recommend my good friend Nate Baldwin, who's going to kick off our sessions and our conversations for today. Go ahead, Nate.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it. Also, just want to say a quick thanks to Rick, Tony, and Joe for the forum to have this conversation. Also thank Steve Boyle, who I'm going to introduce here in a minute. It's been great to just have these conversations with these gentlemen and talk about how we wanted to structure this session and make it solution focused. And I'm looking forward to a lot of great conversation and topical solutions here. So I'll just give you a quick background on myself for those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet. My name again is Nate Baldwin. I was the recreation programmer in charge of youth sports for the city of Appleton, Wisconsin, from about 2014 up until about 2 months ago. So you could say I've been one of the casualties of COVID, unfortunately. One of the interesting things, though, is that the last couple of months have also given me the opportunity to kind of take a higher level view of the state of youth sports in our country. And it's been interesting to talk with so many of you who are on this call today, to explore the challenges facing many of us in different parts of the country. I think what binds us all together is that none of us have been able to practice our craft in the last couple of months. And so the challenge has been how to make ourselves useful, how to make ourselves helpful, but also while still preparing for what's to come as we emerge from stay-at-home orders and we resume youth sport within the scope of what's sure to be a new reality. So as we all know, and as Rick alluded to a little bit, there's been an overwhelming amount of content produced around these topics as a result. Much of it has been informational, but not as much of it has been focused on real actionable solutions for providers on the ground. So I think that's what we hope this session will be today. And we're going to be doing that by engaging all of you actively in sharing those solutions. Not all of them will be perfect, but I think what we're looking is to educate each other and reassure each other on the things that we are implementing on the ground to return to active sport in the midst of our new reality. So as I mentioned, my own personal situation, it's given me kind of a unique opportunity to look at the industry more holistically than just within the context of my own program needs. And so I've tried to take note of some of the common themes that have emerged as I've talked with many of you over the past several weeks. The first one I'll point out is just we're all inexperienced. I mean, this is the first time in 100 years that we have faced a health situation like we're facing. So all of us share in our inexperience with mitigating serious health issues of a pandemic. And we have the added burden of a lack of unified authoritative guidance at a national level, unfortunately. The second theme I want to point out is just acknowledging the logistical considerations and challenges that many of us are facing in returning to play. These are modifications to our programs, contingencies if the best laid plans fail, and also the legalities that apply to whatever our plan might be to return to play. Third theme that I've seen emerge, managing the communication challenges and the unique needs of families that are within our participant bases, and doing so with understanding and with empathy. Not everyone is going to agree, you know, as divisive as this topic has been and as divisive as our country is and at this moment in time, so are our programs, unfortunately. But we need to be able to navigate that communication challenge with understanding and with empathy. And how are we dealing with that? Last one I'll point out, being prepared, ready for a changed landscape when we do eventually return to normalcy. How are we going to assess our families' new priorities, their interests, their appetite for travel, their interest in free play integration, balanced schedules? And then how are we going to deal with the financial realities that are likely to push more families towards local, lower cost recreational options? So what I've heard out there is many of you have echoed these same concerns during pre-registration. And many of these questions are going to be the focus of our breakout sessions here in a few minutes. So that's just my high level overview of the call. And with that, I want to quickly introduce Steve Boyle, who is the founder and director of 241 Sports. They were named a Project Play Champion organization. He himself has been deeply involved in coordinating and delivering programs on the ground and navigating these specific challenges of the pandemic in real time, and brings some fantastic insight. So, Steve, what really triggered a lot of this conversation and this call, as a matter of fact, was a newsletter that you had sent out to your participant base. About how your organization was preparing to navigate the return to play. And it really became our catalyst, as I said, for bringing this session together. So can you walk us through just some of the topics in that newsletter and provide some context?
Sure. And hi, everybody. It's great to see so many of you. We've got some other folks that had been wanting to join from around the globe, but the hour difference was a little bit challenging for some, but people are still entering. So thank you, Joe, Tony, and Rick, for your leadership in this space and for allowing Nate and I to get to have a voice and share it with some of the great folks on this call. So for those of you who don't know me, a little over 10 years ago, we started a program, 241 Sports, Life's Too Short for Just One Sport. And that was while I was also a high school guidance counselor and a multi-sport coach at the high school level, anywhere from freshman, JV, or varsity, and have been involved in sports my whole career. And I only share that piece of it because I really think it's my counseling hat that I sort of bring to this particular part of the conversation. Because one of the challenges I think we're all dealing with is, how do we keep sort of that vision of the child in front of us? Because as scared as I am of COVID right now, I'm also scared of inactivity. I'm also scared of abuse that's happening in homes that are not being reported. I am frightened by the isolation and the impact on the social emotional pieces that kids are normally developing. I was on a walk with somebody the other day and I said, if you're a 10-year-old, this has been a percentage of your life that is much different than many of us on this call. COVID has impacted them in ways that we can't truly understand. And so I was on a call with my staff, my more veteran staff from our flagship program. We have about 600 kids that would normally come in over 2 weeks. And I basically wanted to take the pulse of the staff. And at that point, I was really wavering about whether or not it even made sense. Because I know a lot of folks on here have been saying things like, is this too much too soon? And as Nate was just saying, we literally just don't know, right? Yet we're trying to respond to all the information that's coming out. And I'll be quite honest, I was so frustrated when I was hurry up and waiting for the CDC to finally give us some clear guidance. And as many of you know, it was clear as mud, right? And it was almost juvenile in its language, some of it, right? It was things like, we suggest that staff and children stay home if they're sick and when they arrive at camp. Like, you suggest that? And so finally at that point, I'm like, we have to talk to our staff to sort of see what is their comfort level. And when our trainer was talking, like trainers do, they were worried about very much the responsibility, even from a liability standpoint, that was going to fall on her shoulders. But it was one of our staff that said, Steve, look, normally I'm in the gym and I'm running basketball. She goes, but I'll tell you right now, I'll stay outside all day, every day for 10 days straight in 100-degree heat with my mask on, if it means we can get kids back outside playing. And finally, I was sort of like, okay, well, there we have both ends of the spectrum. And so as boots on the ground practitioners, we spend a lot of time on webinars listening to 30,000 feet, right? And a lot of it is idealism. But we all know when that idealism comes down, and it comes down with soft language, we're the providers. We're the ones who actually have to do it and then say, okay, can we do it with efficacy? And efficacy for each of us might be a little bit different, right? And our programs, there needs to be, certainly, I hope it runs throughout everybody in this call, there needs to be some level of fun. And so if you're being told that you have to do 6 hours of programming and you can't do any interactive play, and kids need to stay 6 feet away the entire time, I mean, we run multi-sport camps. That's just not, it's not feasible. It's not possible. And so part of what we've done as well, at least on the local level, is try to advocate to those who are making the decisions to have some level of rationale so that they understand, like, we get the meaning behind that particular rule, but that's impossible to deliver, right? You know, so those of you that might be involved in volleyball, there's been some memes going out because it's been so silly that some of what we're hearing is you need to wash the ball between every contact, between every player. Well, you can't play volleyball doing that. It means every shot's an ace, right? And then you're going to get another ace. So there's things like that that have come down that we need to be able to talk to folks that are giving guidance to help them understand, look, this is about risk mitigation. We can't be risk-free. And so what are those protocols and practices we can put in place that allow us to continue to program so that kids have a positive experience, but let's not be silly about telling folks that we're running a risk-free program. We don't do that pre-COVID. We're not going to do it during COVID, and we're not going to do it post-COVID. Truth be told, when kids interact, there's risk inherent with that. Now, this is a new risk that we're all trying to figure out, but just like when concussion became the thing, we all responded based on science, based on good recommendations, and we made good plans for practices and protocols to mitigate the risk of concussion. And that's what we're looking to try to do here. So Nate, I hope that gives a little bit of a summary and background just in terms of what was impetus for this particular call.
Yeah, I think that's great stuff. I have just one specific question or series of questions for you that I think would provide great insight for the rest of the group here and kind of give an example of what we're thinking in terms of the breakout conversations that are to come. But understanding that across the country, we've now started to gradually reopen. We've started to quote unquote return to play to some degree. Can you provide some insight as to maybe just a couple of examples of specific solutions that you're implementing at 241 Sports? And also maybe an example or two of the big question marks that still remain for you guys.
Yeah, so in the answer with a lot of this stuff, and even more so now, is it depends. And it depends on provincial government or state government, it depends on municipality, and it depends on the school. And I actually also consult to a global school system known as Whittle School and Studios, where I do some work with them in China and also on their campus in DC. So I'm sort of immersed in this on the regular. I can tell you what we've decided at our largest camps is to really sort of take the state guidelines, because the federal ones have been so vague. And in those places where there haven't been unilateral decisions to just do away with programming or to go virtual, what we're trying to do is really come up with practical solutions based on the current guidelines so that kids can still have a positive experience. So the best example I can give you is that right now, we have a camp that normally would have 280 kids per week. What we're going to do is we're going to cut that down to 180 and do that almost entirely outdoors, where normally we have a 20,000 square field house, 2 gymnasiums, some tennis courts, everything will be grass-based. We're going to shorten our day so that we can take afternoon thunderstorms out of play. And if we feel that thunder and lightning is in the forecast, we're just not going to have programming that day. We will announce cancellation ahead of time. Once kids are there, we're going to put them into cohorts of 10 with no commingling. The children will not be required to wear masks, as is the rules in Connecticut right now. In Connecticut, it's pretty strict on things. But the understanding is they only get to stay with that cohort the whole week. And again, you could look at it and say, well, when they go home, they could be involved in neighborhood play. Well, then that becomes a family decision and a family responsibility. In the same way that we wear masks, not to necessarily protect ourselves, but to protect other people, part of what we're trying to do as much as possible is be as transparent as possible and engage families to be, so align with us in terms of wanting to protect the rest of the families and protect our staff. There's good enough research out there to say that the kids themselves are probably going to be okay, right? But it's the fear for our staff and the fear for the parents and the grandparents of these kids if they are indeed carriers, if they contract it. And so really what it is, it's around being transparent, not guilting anybody, really being super clear and honest with families. You do not have to send your child to camp, right? If you don't feel comfortable, don't feel like it's a badge of honor. And those that run youth sports programs, the kids aren't going to feel like, well, I'm losing out. These are different times. And so a lot of it is just trying to be as clear, transparent, and pay attention to the local guidelines in a way that make families feel supported so that they want to join with us and that we don't force people into making decisions without as much information as possible.
I think you just touched on a couple of really important things. One of them is the specific modifications. And I think for those that are still in the early phases of this, understanding what an organization of your size is trying to do to mitigate the risk is important. But I want to zero in on that second thing you said, and the transparency. I think this is what a lot of organizations are really struggling with. I mean, these are decisions that organizations have never had to make before. And I think there's a temptation to keep those conversations close to the vest and not show your own vulnerability, not show your own struggle with trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong. And I think organizations, there's a real risk there to the organization and their own credibility by not being transparent enough. And I think we need to be, as organizers, we need to be willing to be vulnerable. We need to be willing to share our thought process and let people into our head a little bit and see the struggle that we're having. I think there's always this need to project this strength that maybe we don't have at this moment. I mean, we think we're doing what is best and what is of least risk, but I don't think anyone out there can say with 100% certainty that this is going to work out just the way we planned, because we've never been through this. And I think that transparency is what parents crave. And I think that's what participants crave, is to know that it starts to help them understand that no matter what ends up happening, all of this was done with your best interests in mind as a participant and as a family. And that if a negative outcome occurs, we'll deal with it at that time. But here are all the things we're doing to make sure that your best interests are front and center. And I think that's kind of a lost opportunity that some organizations are missing right now.
And it is an opportunity for those on the call to really be thinking about. So in our coach training model, we call it the CARE path to success. So CARE is culture, ability, relationships, and enjoyment. And so right now there's a real opportunity to think about the culture, relationship, and enjoyment piece around what you do. and sort of redefine yourself with your constituents around those particular pieces. We're all going to focus on ability. That's skill development. That's X's and O's. I mean, that's sport, right? We need to have those pieces, but culture, relationship, and enjoyment, if you are transparent, you can really, sort of begin partnering with parents and the community in a way that maybe we couldn't before. Like, this is an opportunity to do that. So I really feel, Nate, this might be a good time to let's get folks chatting themselves, because I feel like I've been talking too much, quite frankly.
No, I think this is a good time to start transitioning into the breakout and let people start working on those solutions. So just a couple of reminders before we do this, and Rick is going to be doing a lot of the magic here behind the scenes, and I don't even honestly know how he does it all, but we're gonna see it in action here shortly. So just a reminder, this is not meant to be a session to commiserate about problems, commiserate about challenges. We all know that we're as providers, we're all facing unique challenges on the ground, but we want this to be about actionable solutions. So can I just ask Rick, if you can hop in and maybe kind of go over just the quick mechanics of how this breakout is going to work, what people can expect to see when the breakout happens, and then I'll go ahead and introduce the questions.
All right, that sounds great, Nate. Thanks. The way this typically works is we will randomly, automatically just assign you to a group. So you're not going to be with people that you know, if you know anybody on the call, which is a fascinating way to have a conversation. We're going to break you into groups of about 6 individuals in your group. We'll give you 15 minutes to have a conversation based around 3 questions that we will post here in the chat. And we will let you know as well. We will try to hop in and out of your chat room to see how you're doing. But we want you all to have the conversation, and it's not really supposed to be one of those, complaining sessions. It's a solution session. It's an action session. So be considering, based on these questions, what you can do to make everything better for you sports. And when we come back from the conversation, we'll kind of summarize that a little bit so that everybody has a really good idea of next steps.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of that will kind of happen magically here as we move to breakout. So I'm going to introduce the questions here. To come up with these questions, these were your questions. So for those who pre-registered, we kind of scanned you were asked to provide thoughts about your biggest remaining questions as you begin to return to play. And so we kind of scoured those questions for recurring themes and tried to capture those recurring themes as best we could. We were able to break it down into 3 primary areas. So I'll go through those real quick. We're going to include those in the chat, and we're also going to use the broadcast feature so that when you're in your small groups, you are going to be able to refer back to these questions as you need to. First one is, how can or should an organization be communicating the risk and the preparations and modifications to parents to build trust and confidence with their children returning to play? Part 2 of that question is, for parents who do not feel comfortable with their kids returning to play, what should an organization be doing to satisfy their needs? Okay, so that's question 1 to consider. Question 2, what contingencies do organizations like yours have in place for if and when a confirmed infection or outbreak occurs? And are there differences to those contingencies based on if it's a participant versus a coach or a family member? Are there differences in those contingencies? So that's question 2. Third question, how are organizations preparing for the business impact of COVID, particularly post-COVID? What are you doing to address participation and retention? How are you managing the financial burden of lower numbers versus any static costs you may have, such as staffing or field rentals or other similar types of costs? So that's question 3. Again, we'll put those in the chat. We'll put those in the broadcast feature so you can refer back to these. A couple of just general guidelines. Actually, before I move on to that, Steve, is there anything you want to add in regards to those questions or build on that I might have not included?
Yeah, I think when you break out, obviously, if people can come off of mute and go to video so that you can get to know the folks in your small group, that would be great. I think if you can designate a willing spokesperson for when we come back to represent your group. That would be really helpful. And really, you know, because there's a lot to digest, and 15 minutes, I think, is going to go really quickly. It's just, if you could come back almost with an elevator pitch, as if you were trying to sort of, you know, convince the rest of the folks in this group of why your solution is one that can be really helpful for the entire group. Try to keep it in that context. We have people from many different areas in around the world, but from different sports. So, but just if you could have kind of that sort of sales pitch, a kind of a mission statement, if you will, that would be great.
So just a couple of quick housekeeping items. When you get into your group, notice near the top of the screen, you're going to have a group number. So take note of your group number, because when we reconvene, we're going to be going through the different groups and asking you to report back. We're going to give you a 3-minute warning. So once we give you that 3-minute warning, that's a good time to start to address that item that Steve just mentioned, trying to come up with those elevator pitch statements for the 3 questions that we just referred to you. Let me see if there's anything else before I forget. When you come back, we are going to be documenting those responses, and we'll make sure that that's available as we wrap up the call. You guys adjust to that for a moment. I know group 1 was probably all ready to go. We'll start with group 5. So group 5, if you've got a spokesperson and can kind of walk us through your takeaway thoughts for those 3 questions, we will be jotting some of those thoughts down, and we'll kind of share back at the end of this session here.
Joe, is your silence you saying that you don't want to be the spokesperson? Is that what I'm not hearing right now?
Michael, you spoke 65% of the time, so you get to keep talking.
You get to own this one, Mike.
Fair enough.
Ship.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I think with regard to the first question about communication and, you know, how the kind of consensus for our group was, very simply put, transparency and variety. Reach out and in as many ways as you can, let people know, be cognizant of the accessibility of the information, and be like Nate said and Steve said both at the beginning, be transparent and let people know that you're there to help, you're there to take care of, and you're there to continue to provide quality experiences. One thing that we did talk about from that aspect was also being cognizant of how much information is out there. I made mention in our group that I'm in the education space, and the #1 complaint from parents when we went from in-school learning to online learning was just the vast increase of information that was sent home on a regular basis, and parents struggled to sift through it. And I think if we continue to do that with the youth sports space and couple that with the news and couple that with new regulations and guidelines, I think we might be at risk of kind of scaring some parents away, letting them throw their hands up and just say, I'm done with it, heck with it. Anything else that I missed on that first question, Joe or Glenn or Rob?
That's good.
No, you covered it.
All right. And then the second question, we had talked about, you know, just kind of we asked the question, should it or does it make a difference if it's a coach or family member or player that contracts the virus? Does it? We didn't really have an answer for that. We had talked about what some organizations were doing. Joe made a really good point, is sometimes in a youth sports space, we typically try to wait for the high school space to make the decisions, but then the high school space waits for college level decisions. And so we're kind of at the mercy of larger or large-ish organizations. We had talked about some places weren't even waiting for confirmed infections. They were just doing a 14-day lockdown after symptoms had presented. And then lastly, the final question, we didn't have a ton of time for this one, but we just talked about a guy, Rob, on our call or in our group, made mention that his community really stepped up big time and helped out with registration fees and donating registration fees. one thing that I was thinking about when we were getting back into our large group, and this is something that I heard from Steve the first time I met him, is that schools are the best place for recreational activities, right? And I think there's a really good opportunity for schools and youth sport leagues to kind of get on the same page with regard to, space, fields, gyms, maybe even equipment if necessary. Just a good kind of partnership opportunity there. So.
Okay. Great thoughts, and we appreciate that. I'm going to trust that Joe is documenting some of those primary thoughts. We will move on to group 4. I would just say, just in the interest of time, if group 4 and beyond could kind of keep it to one main thought per question, then we'll make sure we get through all the remaining groups and keep us on target for a 5 p.m. finish. So group 4, do you have a spokesperson that could walk us through those 3 questions?
Yeah, our group had been focused on 1 and 3. I don't think we really got much of a group consensus on the second part in terms of infection. But for the first part with information is just funneling down. There's going to be a lot of information, like group 5 said, but funneling down information of what's pertinent to your program and activity so that the campers, the athletes, anybody involved in what you're providing them is hearing what your protocols are and what they need to know for where their child or their athlete's going for your event. So we had some places where one county over, they have a total different set of rules in order, but you're in this county, you have to adhere to these guidelines. So it's kind of just giving the people what they need to know for your activity and leaving it at that and kind of just giving them the basis of that. The third question, we all considering the camps are running at a loss. A lot of camps are running at a loss, and it's almost like we want to put on something for people out there during these times. And just knowing that we're going to be giving our best in limited situations to keep the kids safe and active and keeping them at the forefront. So the athlete the participant is the focus. The camp is kind of what we're providing, but that athlete is going to be cared for and they're the number one priority.
Fantastic. Thanks for those thoughts. Appreciate it. We've got those ideas documented. Group 3, do you have a spokesperson able to share thoughts about those 3 questions?
And just so we're clear, you do not have to have a long beard in order to be a spokesperson, okay?
Yeah, we're 2 for 2 on that.
Or hair?
Or hair, yeah.
Let's see what group 3's got.
I think I was group 3. I'm not sure.
Oh, no beard.
I don't know. And I don't have a beard, but.
Bummer.
So, yeah, one of the things we talked about was like, as much as we can, communicating the risks to parents and the steps and protocols taking to limit those risks, but ultimately, a lot of this is going to be up to parents to decide what they're comfortable with. And at the same time as that, giving them the option, if this is something that's already been planned and paid for, giving them the option for a full refund. And, if they want to opt out, then opt out without any questions asked. But there's so much unknown that a lot of this seems like it's going to be up to the parents to decide what they're willing to do.
Thanks for that, Phil. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on the business side of this, but we'll stay on afterwards for some more pointed or specific questions. But I think you raised a good point in terms of how to really think through what the value proposition is when you're trying to maintain your brand and your relationship with families, and whether that's you're a local municipality or you're a small business or you're running a league. Those are things that you really need to consider in terms of the monetary pieces, because everybody's struggling differently right
Because Steve mentioned it, I'll mention it here before we move on to group 2. But if there are any specific questions that we are not going to be addressing in this main session, feel free to add them in the chat section. And I think the primary group of us are going to stay on for about 10 minutes to kind of have just a brief panel discussion and address any of those pressing questions that you may want to try to get answers to before hopping off this call. So feel free to type them into the chat. Steve, myself, Rick, Joe, anyone else who's interested, we will stay on for some of those panel question and answers after this. So let's move on to group 2. Group 2, if you have a spokesperson that can walk us through the 3 questions and your takeaway thoughts, we will listen.
All right. I'm going to jump in. It was Scott, Dan, Tony, Bill, and I. And really our 3 things that we talked about. First is in the communication aspect to make it graphically appealing. So Dan brought up in their organization, they're going to make it very easy for the parents to see the breakdown, the categories and how they've made decisions and deliver that in a way that everyone in the organization can understand it. And then we talked about education, and particularly towards parents. There's probably a lot of parents on this call, so making that a relational bridge in between and really understanding that that education is motivation, and we're really trying to motivate everyone in the organization to see the urgency that we see to move people into or move everyone forward. And then the last one that was brought up that kind of threw me into the spokesperson role was about tracking injuries. And our real concern, as I've been tracking injuries over the last year and seeing that August and September really ramps up, and to really use that as another bridge to a risk that we don't want to see in our kids. And so those were the 3 things that we talked about in graphics, and then education, and then, the science or sports science of, what injuries could happen, soft tissue wise, detraining wise, which was mentioned in the chat. So those are our takeaways.
That graphic idea is very interesting. And I've seen some organizations using, like, when we're going to return with modified practices and grids that identify what 10 feet apart is, exactly what that's going to look like when you arrive at that first practice. That's that's an interesting thought. Good takeaway there. All right, thanks for group 2. Let's hit group 1 last, and if you can have a spokesperson give us your 3 takeaway thoughts, we'll wrap up feedback from the groups.
Hey guys, anybody else from group 1, feel free to hop in. We had a really good discussion. Just on the detraining thing, I think Eric Cressey of the New York Yankees has been putting out some really good stuff baseball-wise. So if you've never heard of Eric Cressey, I would check him out. So trying not to repeat what other people said, some just interesting thoughts that were brought up. One was on the parents' communication, how to balance parents who are really concerned with parents who are not concerned. If parents think you're going too far and you're doing too much and they want, their kid to be able to play. And communicating to groups where there's a big difference in opinion and fear about COVID. And I thought that was a really interesting point that was brought up. On number 2, one of the guys said their approach was alert, trace, eliminate, follow up. And he had a very quick answer for this is what we're going to do in our organization. And I was impressed with that. We talked about, what do you do with the kids in a cohort if someone in their group tests positive? What do you do with the other 9 kids? How do you handle that? How available is testing in your area? And then on the business impact, we talked about the risk of getting an infection and then the town being afraid of your camp and really losing business long term because there was a report to the local health center that you guys had something that came out. And also the quality of experience of your brand. If this is going to be very different than normal, what's the risk going forward of not putting on the experience people are used to? That was what we talked about.
To some of those last points you made, were there any solutions proposed in terms of mitigating that risk to the brand, or how to tread lightly, balancing all those different factors. Any thoughts?
Again, anybody else can welcome to chime in. I think there it comes back to communication and saying that as much as anything, we're trying to provide sort of a mental health outlet for your kids. You know, this is not going to be the same experience they've had the last 7 summers with us, but we think something is better than nothing. And please bear with us and let your kids know, like, it's not going to be the same. And hopefully next year or 2 years from now, we'll be back to the awesome experience it was. But, you know, from the beginning, frame it as something's better than nothing, and something safe is certainly better than nothing.
And Nate, thanks for that, Jeff. And I think one of the pieces, we're all coming from different organizations, right? And so 241 Sports is an LLC, a limited liability corporation, and as a small business, you have an umbrella, hopefully, that they can't come after the other things. But again, this comes with the transparency, and also our waivers are going to be way different. We're going to have very COVID-specific waivers. But I think that, Chris, you brought up something that was interesting that segued into Jeff's thoughts there, is that, and this is my counselor hat again, is that many of us who are doing summer programming, and whether that's going to be in leagues or it's going to be in summer school or in summer camps, we all almost always have to do some level of abuse and neglect training. Now, I want us all to be aware that many of these children have been at home since March. And across the country, abuse reporting is way down. And many people are stupidly saying, well, that's a good thing. Well, it's down because children haven't had a chance to report abuse. And so we really need to be thinking through what are our protocols around being ready for that potential. Because normally in a 1-week summer program, you're not going to detect something that otherwise wouldn't have come out. So it's yet another piece that could be sort of the unknown of all this. So it's something else to be thinking about. Nate, I do want to be conscious and hand it back to you and to Joe that, folks, we're at the hour, but I don't want to end the conversation. So I know we had some wrap up stuff we wanted to do before any folks did leave, but then stay on for folks that want to stay.
Yeah, same here. We want to be respectful of everyone's time, but first I want to thank everybody for sharing their thoughts from their groups. I think there were some great takeaways here, and our goal is to try to capture those takeaways and not rush them out to you immediately after this conversation, but we want to assemble those into something that's useful for you. So especially if you pre-registered, we will be sending that back out to the assembled group here with some structured, categorized thoughts. A couple of common themes I heard throughout all 5 groups, and I think it's great. Obviously, it's the communication piece. It's critical. The transparency, that part is critical. Making sure that your clients, your parents, your kids, their families that participate with you, they understand your thought process, and they understand that your heart is focused on their best interests. And I think that's a critical theme that was through all 5 groups: transparency and the need for communication. And I think the other acknowledgement that I heard through a lot of the groups is that parents are going to be in very different places depending on what their own thoughts, politics, perspectives are. And we need to be very nimble as providers to deal with perspectives that are going to be all over the map and still keep a focus on providing a high quality, safe program. So that's a challenge, and we're going to learn a lot from this process. And next time, hopefully in 100 years, when a pandemic comes along, we'll be better prepared to deal with that. But so those are just some of my final thoughts. Like I mentioned before, if you have specific questions we haven't gotten to, we're going to hang out for a little bit post call, and anyone is welcome to hang on, and we can have kind of a panel discussion about it. I guess, Steve, any final thoughts from you?
No, I'm excited to stay on with folks that would like to. And Joe or Rick, I'm not sure which one of you guys was going to do sort of the wrap up. We're going to put a link into the chat box as well for folks to make sure that if you didn't pre-register, we get your contact info and whatever, and then the recording of the Zoom as well. Joe or Rick, one of you guys want to take that?
I vote for Joe.
I just want to thank everybody for being on today. I don't think all the answers were provided in 1 hour. I think all of us are in this, in some ways, a holding pattern as we kind of wait to see what others are doing, what's going to happen at the state level and also at local level. But again, I think forums such as this, where we can share, information and thoughts about what you're thinking, what people in your organization are thinking, become an important area. So when we were first conceiving this idea, I made the point, like, I don't think this is just going to be a one and done thing. I think this may be something that we may have to revisit again as well. So yeah, we're going to convene. We're going to carry this on for another 10, 15 minutes or whatever, if you want to stay on, and in terms of a panel discussion. If you didn't have your questions answered, or you yourself have some important thoughts to share, we'll stay on. This is being recorded. It will be available at the LTADchat YouTube channel. More than likely, we can process that by late tonight, if not early tomorrow morning. So you can go back, listen to it, share it with other people in your community and your organization. Obviously, you're going to be busy within your own organization and community as well, because you're going to have to share information like this and probably come up with your own policies that are going to be based on, national recommendations and guidelines, along with state and local policy as well. So thanks again for everybody for being on. I'm going to turn it over now to back over to Nate and Steve to see how they want to go about doing the panel discussion.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again, everybody, for attending the main session. Why don't we give it maybe a minute to transition and give us a chance to kind of read through some of the questions that have come in, and then we'll pick up in a minute and start that next phase here. Thanks, everybody.
As we wait, Nate and Steve, if people have questions and they're still on, are you okay with them unmuting and just asking a question? Or
I'd actually prefer that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or stating something like, hey, we were a bit rushed in our breakout group. Here's one thing that, I've been working on in my organization, I think is really important to this conversation in terms of the solution.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, please, let's have at it. If anybody has any questions now and wants to get it started, and if there's other folks that want to chime in on a reply. Dan, I see your hand go.
Jump in. Well, first and foremost, thank you guys for putting this together. And Joe, go green. I think we have some friends in the area who've collaborated with you. So I run a large soccer organization in Northern Virginia. And we are in the process of assembling our return to play procedure. What we're struggling with right now, just to give you perspective, Northern Virginia is in phase 1, so we can have groups of 10 individuals come together. So we're laying this all out, trying to keep cohorts consistent. But the one thing that we are really, really struggling with right now is what that internal protocol is going to be when or if we have a positive case brought to our attention, or even just someone comes to say, hey, I'm feeling sick today. I'm curious what other organizations may already have in place in regards to how they're going to handle that shutdown. Is it going to be just for that cohort? Is it going to be anyone who was on the field at that time? We're struggling with how we're going to shut things down if we run into that, because there's, out of all the webinars I've been on, the one piece of advice that rings true for me right now is it's not a question, or it's more important how we return to the field than when we return to the field. And I know there's never going to be a protocol or a solution that's going to cover every scenario, but we just want to try to have something in place so we're prepared for the worst.
Just one real quick point I want to make on that, and I'm not running a program this summer myself, and so I can't speak real eloquently on that part of it. But I will say that, at least in Wisconsin, city health departments and county health departments they have the infrastructure, the contact tracers, and the policies in place to intervene in a situation where an organization has a positive confirmed case or a suspected confirmed case. And so I would say you may have done this already, or other organizations may have done this already, but you're going to want to have them ready to contact. You're going to want to have your staff ready to contact those agencies if need be, because they're going to be in a much better position than a sports-oriented organization, perhaps, to do what's necessary from a health perspective to mitigate risk on that. So I just wanted to throw that out there, at least from the state of Wisconsin. That's something that's in place, and I would assume that's other states as well.
Yeah, Dan, I would say this is another transparency piece, right? I think sharing that that's a concern of yours with your constituents and saying we're going to follow whatever the local protocols are, but this is why we're going to do it, and it doesn't feel random. Because, you know, especially if you're running programming with young kids and you have a cohort of 10, if you've stated up front that if anybody in that cohort gets diagnosed, well, by process of elimination, there's almost HIPAA compliant things that are happening there now too, right? Because all of a sudden the kids are like, oh, Jimmy got COVID and now Jimmy's ostracized because I can't go back to play because Jimmy got COVID. And so you have to also build in what's your communication structure for when that actually happens in a way that families understand, and that you protect as best you can what the identity is, or you just say, we have a duty to inform. And that might be what the local health department says, is you have a duty to inform, and then families can then decide on whether or not they want to continue. Because, you know, do they have it? Do they have symptoms? Have they come in contact with somebody? Because there's all varying degrees around this. So I think coming up with really clear what if situations and then being transparent to families is the best thing you can do under these circumstances. Raphael, you had your hand up second, and I think John third from what I saw, unless I saw something different, Joe.
Well, I think in two scenarios, one, we have an option to teach these kids how to properly respond to tail off of that. And so having something in place to be able to say, ex-athlete Johnny has tested positive, can we come together in support of, because words matter, and how we approach this will make all the difference in the world. If I go open communication and just go to the CDC and authorities, it may alienate Johnny, and Johnny's friends will again alienate him. And so being able to have that communication in place to be able to say, guys, I've got some bad news. Sarah has just tested positive. We need to do what we can for her and her family. It immediately sets the tone in support of that athlete. I raised my hand earlier because I wanted to share, and hopefully you guys would learn from some of the mistakes I've made. A long time ago, I had a same scenario, different situation. Was a dad came to me and he wanted me to work with his all-pro 8-year-old baseball player. And he was really driving, you know, same old scenario. And I said, well, we really don't do that. I'm going to teach your athlete how to be, I'll teach him how to be a better athlete, but I'm not really here to make him an all-star baseball player. And his dad was really, really pushy, really, really adamant about my reputation and me working with him. And I didn't budge. And to find out later, the kid was abused. And so what I want everybody to know is I made the mistake of not bending, and I lost the immediate war. I could have easily said, yes, you know, grayscale, I can help with that. I can do that. And maybe the kid would have been in my care and I could have been a better positive influence. And along this COVID thing, what if I'm so hardlined that I turn parents away and I miss an opportunity to be a positive influence on one of these? So I want some of us coaches to be able to say, you know what? Oh yeah, absolutely. We can do that, just as an idea to maybe get the ball rolling and to help create a better situation for some of these kids who have been in some rough places.
And if I could add a point to that, especially with regard to what are the kids going to say? How can we support, Johnny or Jimmy or whoever it was? But at the same time, we need to be prepared as to how to support the rest of the athletes, because there's going to be athletes out there that know that means if Jimmy has it, that means that I could have it. And now I'm nervous and now I'm anxious. And so we need to be prepared for that kind of storm as well, and how to handle and approach those situations.
Amen.
Thank you both for that. John, I think you had a question.
Yeah, guys, thanks, Steve. I would be curious to know, because I'm going to be advising the local youth football commission in a parent and coaches clinic here in July. How, it's tough enough at the high school level. I know when I coached high school football, to get a certified trainer to be on site as a first responder. Obviously most programs require coaches to be trained in first aid and that kind of thing. But how worthwhile is it for these organizations to try and reach out and have, an actual medical doctor based on the scope of this on site, even if it's a volunteer? Or is that going to create more confusion or overload the system? Is that even feasible to consider? I mean, Steve, in your case, are you guys thinking about taking that extra step when you start having, assemblages of people on site?
Yeah, John, it's a really good question, and it comes from a place of socioeconomic situation as well, right? And so by law in Connecticut, we have to have a doctor who will sign off on whatever our trainer has done that week, that they're going to sign off, that they're going to see whatever our medical records were, everything we did. But to actually be able to get a doctor on site for programming would be cost prohibitive for 95 to 99% of us, I would have to imagine, in terms of what we're doing. So I think having the guidance and support, right, to get someone to take a look at, these are our protocols, these are our practices that we're going to put in place. And Dr. Jones has signed off on this, and Dr. Jones is from our community and believes in what we do, and he or she is in support of these protocols. That's probably more realistic and will add a little bit of credibility, but I think the realism of being able to get folks actually on site, I would find it terribly challenging for sure.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Appreciate it, guys.
Yeah.
Chris Moreland had a good, just a sidebar question that I think would be good to just poll the whole group, and that is, does anyone in the group have any experience with a positive test result of a young athlete, parent, or coach? And is there anyone out in this group who has experienced an individual that has tested positive?
So, Nate, I haven't, because I don't actively coach right now. I'm with USA Swimming and do consulting with our teams and coaches. I don't have a personal experience, but I've spoken with a coach whose team had that experience last week of a parent testing positive with 2 kids on the team. And so fortunately for them, the parent was very transparent. He happened to be a health and safety officer for the corporation he works for, so he understood the implications of it, but notified the team right away, got his kids in to be tested right away, and those coaches notified the athletes and families in those groups that there was a household that had a positive test. I haven't heard whether the athletes came back as positive or yet or not. But because of the social distancing and physical distancing protocols that the team was following, actually under the CDC guidelines, there's not a necessity to shut down the program immediately. Now, if it turns out those 2 kids were positive and then other kids in those training groups have positives, that might take a different protocol. But I think your your point, Nate, about following the recommendations from the local health department as you're developing your plan and your protocols is the key thing, because they're going to get the results and they're going to initiate contact tracing, right? And so you don't, it's not the responsibility of the organization to do contact tracing, but I do think that idea of duty to report and being transparent with your families is a very important one in this time. And the majority of our teams, I can't say all because I don't know all 3,000 teams around the country, but the majority of our teams are following some pretty strict protocols in terms of how athletes are coming into practice, how practice is conducted, how athletes leave practice, who's in a practice group, and how they are spaced out in the pool to really limit any kind of close physical interactions, either between athletes or between coaches and athletes. So I think starting out as cautiously as you can and being very thoughtful about that is really important. We're starting to get, unfortunately, pushback from some coaches and some parents who see football teams and soccer teams out practicing, on the fields somewhere and not maintaining any type of social distancing and wondering why, why the swim team is being so strict. But, our advice to our teams has been, let's be this sport that does it right, so that if there is, this second wave and there's, more stringent restrictions come into place, maybe there's a way for us to be able to continue to practice because we've been doing so safely. But we provided some guidelines, and I put a link to it in the chat. We provided some guidelines to our clubs. This is probably almost a month ago now, before really anybody had a chance to get back into the pool, and encourage them to be proactive in developing their guidelines for their specific situation, communicating with their facilities, because obviously we're extremely at the mercy of whoever operates the facilities that we're in. Communicate with the facilities, communicate with their local health departments, and get approval for their plan or get feedback for their plan and adjust it before they even thought about putting kids in the water.
I think the big advantage with that is just leveraging the infrastructure that's already in place to deal with this, rather than feel like we're on an island needing to come up with our own tight solution. We're just one piece of that overall puzzle, which is why I mentioned it before, that let's make sure we're leveraging the tools that are already there and the resources and the people who do this at an expert level, whereas we're just trying to figure it out as we go. I think that's an important takeaway too. But yeah, thanks for all those thoughts, Mark. I think that's great stuff.
Yeah, I would just also add that the modeling piece is so key, that you have to recognize what your why is for why you are choosing your particular response to this. And if you're looking over the fence to see what are other people doing, and that's going to dictate how you're doing it, then that's not really your value system. So you have to really determine, for you and your organization, keeping everybody's best interest in mind, plus the safety of not just the children, but again, who the children are going home to, and the reputation of your particular program over the long haul. Really important what Mark said there, to not be responding to, well, that's, my parents are saying, well, this team is doing that, and what have you. So at any rate, Mike, thank you for that. I know you just signed off. Joel, looks like you got your hand up, bud.
Yeah, thanks. I work with Mark at USA Swimming. Just to go along with what Mark said, we've been talking to a few other national governing bodies about essentially home to drop off, trying to come up with a plan for every sport to have essentially the same protocol, knowing that locales are different, but primarily some of those social distancing aspects, some of those sort of best practices from pickup to drop off could work well if we all did them, just so parents with kids in multiple sports would get familiar and comfortable with the idea of doing things the same way over and over again. So trying to start some dialogue among sports about all the things we can do before we get to the actual practice itself. And it may look very different depending on the sport you're engaged in. Whether you're playing lacrosse or you're playing hockey or you're swimming, that part may look different, but everything up until you walk into the actual door. So the no carpooling, the maintaining distancing when you're walking in, the ingress and egress rules, the temperature taking or not temperature taking, but maybe just a questionnaire about that, and taking the temperatures at home, a variety of things. So just wondering about the interest of the group in sort of developing those protocols that go across sports so that families become very comfortable with them. So we don't have those questions about why is so-and-so doing this, because we know they're going to be rogue actors in all of our sports. And it's easier to identify them if people are maintaining those best practices. And then the other just thought for the group that we're struggling with, we put out this document about return to practice several weeks ago, but of course now we're getting pressure that now that certain parts of the country are opening up on a return to competition protocol. And so wondering if sports out there have a concern about level playing field. We know that we've got a significant number of our 400,000 members across the country that still don't have access to any type of a practice, let alone even a thought about competition. And yet we've got places in the Dakotas and Florida that are have been approved to have competitions. So, wondering how groups are handling that too. Thanks.
Joe, I'll just give a quick response. I mean, first of all, if we had a Ministry of Sport, this would be a lot easier, right? And so we're often at the mercy of NGB's willingness to do what you're suggesting, and certainly Chris Snyder and folks like that have been putting some stuff out from the USOPC that have been helpful. But like a lot of things you all do at the NGB level, if you can't mandate it and it's not coordinated, then people are going to go rogue, right? And so, but I think Project Play's done their best to try to have some consistency in this messaging, but I don't think it's been really direct like you just described. I think it's just been like when we started this, we talked about the fact that people it's an idealism, right? So the 30,000 foot stuff is, it would be nice if you would do this, but there's no teeth behind it unless we can figure out how to put teeth behind it. And so I'd love to, because even as the life's too short for just one sport guy who's been trying to get some common practices amongst all sports, it's so darn challenging. So I don't know if others on the call would like to chime in, but I do think that's why this is a grassroots call, right? Because we've all heard and learned the things coming from the top down, but then how do we deliver it with efficacy from bottom up on the school-based program? Nate?
I'll just say, because it's a grassroots call, I think there's an opportunity for grassroots solution. And even if something on a national scale would be extremely difficult to implement, and I think it would, I think there's opportunity on a local scale to seek these isolated solutions. If they're in a local community, for example, my community here, we're about 100,000. Our city is 100,000. Our region is about 350,000. But it's also an environment where, the park and rec director knows the school superintendent, who knows the different club directors. And there's an opportunity to have dialogue within those three sport pillars of the community and make those best practices actionable, and make sure that there's consistency from one to another. So no matter what environment within the local community you are participating in sport, there's going to be some consistent actions that you're going to experience across all of them if you have dialogue and understanding amongst those individuals who lead those three different pillars. So I think there's local opportunity, and perhaps that's a bottom-up solution. I'm kind of spitballing here a little bit, but perhaps that's a bottom-up solution where, you solve it more on a local level, and that becomes a model for what you can do on more of a regional or national level as time goes on. The dilemma is that, this is a time where we need, quick action in a short amount of time. And so we might have to take those victories as we can achieve them.
Yeah, I think that the grassroots part is obviously a huge part of it. And I'm becoming, unfortunately, that parent who has 3 sons who play 7 different sports. And so every time they talk about coming back, I'm like, hey, I'll help you. I helped write the plan for USA Swimming. I'll help write your plan for how you can bring these kids back. And so I'm becoming that parent right now. But just trying to think about a way I could become not that parent and actually think about some larger scale action. But thanks. Those are helpful responses.
Yeah, but Joel, I'll be quite honest. Unless you're that parent, when you're doing that top-down piece, it needs to come from the soul. It needs to come from driving kids, 3,000 miles to play the town next door, or the fact that you haven't had a family dinner in 2 weeks. So those are the pieces that really create change. And so, don't lose that hat, man. Just do it both. And obviously, you're thinking the right way. So thanks so much for that.
Steve, I wanted to comment off the USA Swimming stuff. So guys, thanks for bringing that to our attention. And I'm curious to know how many of the NGBs are trying to put together a sport agnostic protocol for whether it be home to practice or other aspects. And I'm going to bring Tony and Rick on this as well, because currently we're involved with what's called the Joint Commission of Sports Medicine and Sports Science. So many of the large sports medicine and sports science organizations. And this is just the type of thing where, again, we can't be operating in silos, right? Just as the NGB folks are putting together their stuff, now all of a sudden we have the American College of Sports Medicine doing their thing, the National Strength and Conditioning Association doing their thing, everybody else is. And this group that Tony and Rick specifically have been meeting with, I think is a great opportunity, maybe guys, to bring this sort of thing to their attention. And I'm not sure if there's a call. I think there's a call tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, Tony and Rick.
Yeah, there is, Joe. There's one tomorrow and again Thursday. So that's fantastic. And I'm really excited to hear that NGBs may actually be moving in that direction, because we've been talking about that for a very long time, that there's so many commonalities, especially in an LTAD or an ADM model.
But Rick, don't you think it would be important to bring this specific conversation up? I mean, I know we've been talking more about, making sport look different, right? In terms of more best practices, long-term athletic development. But I mean, some of these things right now they're pressing, right? For us to return to sport in a healthy and safe manner.
Yeah, they're very pressing. In fact, it's exciting to see that the Joint Commission is actually looking to see how they can have collective impact across youth sports. So USOPC is a member of the Joint Commission, actually. So so is ACSM, NSCA, and a lot of youth-serving organizations, but not enough. So there are a lot of other health organizations that should be a part of that. And I think with trying to put together a collective impact across all sports realms, across health and everything else, there's some conversations going on about how to have a better impact with some of the big documents that are out there, such as the National Youth Sports Strategy, Healthy People 2030, all these things that kind of go on a shelf somewhere but have no legs or teeth. So how do we actually help to engage that? So having something that's coming from USA Swimming or from other NGBs working collectively would be fantastic to be able to share that here's a grassroots effort that's actually working. Because like we started the conversation off, I think it was Nate said, we're starting from the 30,000 feet, but nobody's got their feet on the ground. So this would be an outstanding opportunity to bridge those two.
And the ACES group does have a return to play. The ACES group does have a return to play committee of about 60 NGBs, both Olympic and non-Olympic. They've only met once, but they are putting all the documents together for a follow-up meeting. But it would be, better obviously if there was a better linkage to a health group within that process. I mean, we've incorporated our national team docs and things like that, but quite honestly, it's not as connected to the health side of sports as it should be. At least not in the first meeting.
What group was that, Joel?
It's the ACES group. It's really it's essentially the executive director, CEO group of the NGB world, but it's expanded now to sort of take on this issue. So it's sport development folks like myself, but it's also some of the CEOs like Steve Stenderson from lacrosse who are involved in the group right now.
Got it. Is it multi-sport organizations as well?
There are a few
Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCAs. Yep.
Not as much, getting down to that realm. It's definitely more of the governing body type groups, at least at the moment.
That's good information.
Nate, you want to close us up here, my friend?
Yeah, that 10-minute Q&A turned into a 35-minute Q&A, which is great. This has been fantastic conversation. I've found it to be extremely helpful and insightful, and I'm really appreciative of all the expertise on this call, the panel and the guests. I mean, it's fantastic. All the amazing insights everyone has been willing to share, and I think I know I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else has learned quite a bit as well. I think a lot of it is very applicable to our return to play, and I think a lot of it applies well beyond that too, which is also appreciated. So I think this was a great exercise, and appreciate the opportunity, Rick, Joe, Tony, just the opportunity to have this forum and have this conversation. And it seems like there's an appetite for more in the future. So hopefully we'll have a chance to do this again.
Yeah, just remember that this playground is always open, and you can play on any piece of equipment that you'd like, and
no COVID restrictions.
Yeah, and Zoom allows for social distancing, doesn't it?
Excellent.
But yeah, if you guys or anybody else who's on the call right now, want to have a follow-up, this is a open invitation, to come to this playground at the LTADchat and have these sort of forums.
Can you guys just recap what participants can expect in terms of follow-up, dialogue, ways to engage on social media, things like that? Can you just cover that real quick?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, basically once we finish, we're going to start processing the video. It will then be posted onto the LTADchat YouTube channel. Usually I tweet it out, and we do a lot of our stuff in the NSCA Long-Term Athletic Development Special Interest Group. So you can find that information there. If we do plan on doing a follow-up, or maybe a more specific follow-up to a specific item that's come up, we'll usually put that out on social media channels as well. Again, my Twitter account is Joe_Eisenman. Rick, you want to jump in, give your channel?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I'm at RI Howard 41. So whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, I really like this idea of a sport agnostic approach. So I'm interested in seeing if maybe we could get together as another solution focused session to see how we might put that together. So if anybody's interested, please reach out to anybody here on the panel, Joe, me, Steve, Nate, Tony.
All right, thank you all. Stay safe, and let us know if you could give us some feedback about it on the link we sent, and let's all stay in touch and continue to support each other.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, have a good evening.
Thanks.
All the best.
Yeah. Mark and Joel, thanks for your comments.